can they ask us to tighten our belts for the environment while private jet traffic to Davos hits an all-time high? Let's start at the beginning, because to understand what's happening right now in 2026, you need to understand who built this story in the first place. Who wrote the Green Future script? You've heard the terms net zero, green economy, clean energy transition. They sound inevitable, almost scientific. But here's the first thing to understand. These are not forces of nature. They are policy choices made by specific institutions with specific interests. And by framing this as a policy choice, we begin to understand that everything is open to adjustment and debate, rather than something we must accept as an unchangeable fate. The first author is the United Nations. In 2015, at what's called COP21 in Paris, 195 countries signed an agreement to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That became the founding document of what we now call the Green Transition. From there, the UN launched a campaign called Race to Zero, pressuring not just governments, but corporations, banks, and even individual cities to promise net zero emissions by 2050. The second author is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Think of them as the scientists providing the evidence that justifies these policies. Their 2018 report was particularly influential. It warned in urgent language that the window to prevent catastrophe was closing fast. That report became the trigger. Almost overnight, media attention shifted to electric vehicles, solar panels, and carbon taxes. The third author sits in a Swiss ski town. The World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, is where billionaires, heads of state, and global executives meet every year. If the UN sets the rules, Davos enforces them. They champion what they call stakeholder capitalism, the idea that corporations should restructure how we consume, travel, and produce, all in service of a greener world. And then there are the institutions with real leverage, the investment funds, BlackRock, Vanguard, the largest money managers on Earth. They adopted ESG standards, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. In plain language, this means if your company doesn't have a green plan, we cut off your capital. Automakers, energy companies, manufacturers, all forced to go green, not because it was economically ready, but because the money demanded it. So here is what you're actually looking at. A tight coordination between politics, the UN, science, the IPCC, and finance, Davos and the investment funds. These programs were designed by people sitting in air-conditioned offices in New York and Geneva, while the people most affected by rising fuel prices were ordinary workers in Germany, Thailand, Nigeria, and Ohio. Keep that image in mind. We're going to come back to it. Now, fast forward to April 2026. Something broke. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow channel of water between Iran and Oman, barely 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, carries approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Every day, tankers move roughly 17 to 21 million barrels through that strait. When tensions escalate there, the entire global economy holds its breath. And in early 2026, that's exactly what happened. Oil prices crossed $100 per barrel. Diesel prices in Europe jumped more than 30% in the first weeks of April alone. And suddenly, every elegant policy document from the last decade was put to its most brutal test. This is what analysts call a stress test, and what it revealed was not one failure, but three. The first reality exposed. The post-oil world doesn't exist yet. For years, the WEF and the UN have projected confidence. They speak about the world being ready for a new energy era. Solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles. The narrative was that the transition was already underway, nearly complete. Then, Hormuz tightened. And here's what happened in practice. Electric vehicles cannot keep food moving from farms to grocery stores. Solar panels cannot power the massive cargo ships that move 90% of global trade. The countries that had been loudest about abandoning fossil fuels, Western Europe particularly, suddenly began making emergency calls to Gulf states, asking them to pump more oil. They released strategic reserves. They scrambled for liquefied natural gas from anywhere they could find it. Think about that for a moment. The same governments that spent a decade taxing carbon and banning new oil exploration were now begging for more oil. That is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. That is a policy framework colliding with physical reality. And physical reality won. The second reality. You cannot build a green future on empty stomachs. Here's something the carbon tax advocates rarely include in their presentations. The green transition requires a stable, prosperous economy. It requires people who can afford to spend more on electric vehicles, on heat pumps, on higher electricity prices during the transition period. It requires cheap capital, low inflation, and a general sense that tomorrow will be better than today. Oil at $100 destroys all of that. When diesel spikes, transport costs spike. When transport costs spike, food prices spike. When food prices spike, ordinary households, especially pensioners on fixed incomes, stop thinking about 2050 and start thinking about next week's grocery bill. At that point, a carbon tax is not an environmental policy. It is an insult. The EU saw this clearly in April 2026. 22 out of 30 EU and EEA countries rushed to introduce emergency fuel subsidies or tax cuts almost overnight. France and Portugal targeted low-income families and transport workers. Italy and Spain went broader, trying to prevent street protests. The European Central Bank, which had been holding interest rates steady, suddenly faced the prospect of inflation near 5%, and experts began predicting a rate hike before year's end. The IMF downgraded EU growth to 1.3% for 2026 and quietly warned that if Hormuz tensions continued, Europe could slide into a genuine recession. This is what the green transition looks like when it meets a real oil shock. Not a smooth glide into a cleaner future, a desperate scramble to find enough cheap energy to keep the lights on and the shelves stocked. The third reality. Energy is a weapon, not an ideal. Green agenda documents tend to assume a cooperative world. Nations working together, sharing technology, reducing emissions for the common good. It's a beautiful vision. It also assumes that the countries controlling the world's oil supply share that vision. They don't. Countries like Iran understand something that policy documents from Davos don't acknowledge. Oil flows are political leverage. The ability to threaten a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is worth more in geopolitical negotiations than any emissions reduction pledge. When a single choke point can send global oil prices surging past $100, that's not just an energy fact. It's a military and diplomatic weapon. The international organizations promoting net zero have essentially no ability to counter that. They can write reports, hold summits, and issue statements. They cannot keep tankers moving through a threatened strait. And that gap between idealism and hard power is precisely what 2026 is exposing. Now, let's go one level deeper, because most people don't realize how far oil actually reaches. Everyone understands that oil powers cars and planes, but here's the part that rarely makes it into the green energy headlines. Oil is not just fuel. It is a raw material, the physical foundation of modern industrial civilization. The plastics wrapping every product on your supermarket shelf, made from oil. The tires on your electric vehicle, oil-based. The fertilizers feeding most of the world's crops, derived from oil and natural gas. The lubricants inside a wind turbine, oil. The medical equipment in your hospital, IV bags, syringes, sterile packaging, petrochemicals. The paint on your walls, the synthetic fabric in your clothes, the adhesive in your furniture, all of it traces back to the same source. This is why, when Hormuz is threatened, it doesn't just affect what you pay at the pump. It affects what you pay at the pharmacy. It affects whether your grocery store can keep its shelves stocked. It affects whether the factory that makes the medicine you need can afford to run its production lines. The heavy promotion of electric vehicles, as important as that shift may eventually be, addresses only the smallest visible layer of this dependency. It's like repainting the front door of a house with a crumbling foundation and announcing the renovation is complete. And here's where the net zero label becomes genuinely misleading. Most people hear net zero and assume it means zero emissions. It doesn't. The word net is doing enormous work in that phrase. What it actually means is emissions still exist, but they are theoretically offset by other actions. Planting forests, purchasing carbon credits, funding renewable projects elsewhere. In practice, an oil company can continue extracting oil, burning it, and emitting exactly as before, and still claim net zero status by purchasing forest land in a developing country and calling it an offset. The critics have a word for this: greenwashing. And the carbon credit market has become, in many cases, exactly that: a financial instrument that allows wealthy corporations and wealthy nations to continue business as usual while purchasing the appearance of virtue. Here's the deeper irony. The wealthy nations now championing the green transition, Europe, the United States, industrialized over 2 centuries using the cheapest possible fossil fuels with no environmental restrictions whatsoever. They built their prosperity on coal, oil, and gas. Now, from that position of comfort, they are telling developing nations, you must transition to clean energy, which is more expensive, more technologically demanding, and requires infrastructure you don't yet have. The EU's carbon border tax, officially called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, effectively puts a tariff on imports from countries with less strict emissions rules. In plain language, it makes it harder for poorer nations to sell goods into European markets. A green policy that functions as a trade barrier against the world's poorest economies is worth examining very carefully. So here's the question that matters for the next 20 to 30 years. Where does this actually go? The honest answer from most energy analysts, not the ones speaking at Davos, but the ones who study physical energy flows, is this: oil will remain central to the global economy for decades. Not because we love oil, not because the environmental concerns are wrong, but because the alternatives are not yet scalable, affordable, or capable of replacing what oil does across the entire industrial system. The more realistic long-term picture is a diversified energy mix, where nuclear power, which produces zero emissions and operates regardless of weather, plays a much larger role than it currently does. Where hydrogen, for heavy transport and industry, fills gaps that electricity cannot. Where oil and gas decline gradually, over decades, rather than being abolished by policy deadline. The green narrative promoted by media is like an elegant dessert, appealing, photogenic, emotionally satisfying. But oil is the main course. You don't survive on dessert alone. And now let me ask you something directly, because this is the part that matters most. You're watching this happen in real time. The gas prices, the headlines, the politicians announcing emergency measures while still claiming the transition is on track. You're old enough to have lived through the 1970s oil shocks, the 1990s economic uncertainty, the 2008 financial crisis. You know what it feels like when a system that was supposed to be stable turns out to be fragile. So here's what I want you to think about. When the loudest voices for the green transition are speaking from air-conditioned conference rooms in Zurich, powered by electricity still largely generated by fossil fuels, while ordinary families are recalculating their budgets at the kitchen table, what does that tell you about who this transition is actually designed to serve? When the same environmental activists who warned us about oil dependency are now quietly waiting for oil prices to drop so the grid electricity becomes affordable again, what does their silence tell you about how deep the green ideal actually runs? And when the International Energy Agency, the body that urged countries to stop investing in new oil fields, is now urging member states to release emergency reserves just to keep the economy functioning. What does that tell you about the gap between the plan and the reality? Here's the conclusion that the data points to. The world is not breaking free from energy dependency. It is reorganizing it, moving from dependence on oil-producing nations to dependence on the countries that control lithium, cobalt, copper, and rare earth minerals, largely China. The supply chains for electric vehicle batteries run through the same kinds of geopolitical choke points as oil tanker routes. We are not eliminating risk, we are relocating it. The ordinary people who feel this most acutely, who watch fuel prices rise, food bills climb, and heating costs strain their fixed incomes, are not wrong to feel that something doesn't add up. They're the most accurate economists in the room. They don't need a think tank report. They read reality at the gas station, at the grocery store, and in their monthly utility bill. The Strait of Hormuz crisis of 2026 is not an anomaly. It is a demonstration. A demonstration that the physical world operates by different rules than the policy world. That energy security is not a background condition you can take for granted while building an ideal future. It is the foundation that either holds everything up or lets everything collapse. And perhaps the most important thing you can do right now, whether you're managing a household budget, advising a small business, or simply trying to understand what's coming, is to see clearly what this moment is actually showing you. Not what the headlines say, not what the summits declare, what the data shows. Oil is not going away quietly, and the sooner the institutions designing our energy future acknowledge that, honestly, without the branding, the sooner we can build something that actually works for everyone. So let me ask you, after everything I've just walked through, the green narrative, the Hormuz shock, the gap between policy and reality, what's the one thing that surprised you most? Drop it in the comments, because the conversation that follows might be more important than anything I just said.